We are in Chavav Base 26b. We come to a rather interesting discussion in the Gemara, centered around the words of our Mishnah, which said, so we're at the third line, Chutz min hakatan, etc. And the etc. is actually really what we're going to be discussing for the most part. And the etc. there is, with the exception of a child, a minor, and the exception of one who is not a man. Now, this is referring to the Mishnah, which states, after the Mishnah discusses the husband and wife and who qualifies as a Sotah, what kind of relationship they have, what kind of woman she is, what kind of guy he is, and so on, in terms of their legal status. Then the Mishnah discusses the person about whom she is being warned. So we established in the most recent class on Friday that the husband retains the right to warn his wife against secluding herself, even with her family members, if there is room or reason for suspicion. All right, so further to that discussion as to who he can warn her about, we were told, Chutz min hakatan, we exclude a minor. So if he warns her not to seclude herself with a minor, it's a meaningless warning. And likewise, the Mishnah said, if he warned her to seclude herself with someone who is, quote, not a man, also the warning is meaningless. So very briefly, the Gemara is going to cite the verse, which indicates this law, that he has to warn her against secluding herself with a man. And a man excludes a child, a minor, as well as it excludes someone who's not a man. And then the Gemara is going to get into who exactly is this, quote, not a man, that the Mishnah is saying that a warning about secluding herself with him is meaningless. Be clear? So who are we excluding from the list? When the Mishnah says, not a man, who are we excluding? Who is this not man that is not part of the warning? Or the person about which his warning would be meaningless? Yeah?
Well, what's that?
What's being excluded?
Define that verse, I guess.
The Mishnah. The Mishnah stated, not a man.
Yeah.
Meaning, if he warns her against secluding herself with one who is, quote, not a man, the warning is meaningless. So who is this not a man? That's what we're going to get. That's right. That's what we're going to get into. Okay. So says the Gemara, the fourth line. Ish. The verse states, he warns her. Right, where's the verse? No, sorry, that's the wrong verse. Yeah, the verse refers to the person about which she's being suspected as an ish, as a man. Amar Achmana is what the verse states. V'loi katan, and this excludes a minor, because the verse says he's warning her, or she's suspected with a man, and a minor doesn't qualify as an ish, as a man. The she'ena ish, and likewise, he cannot warn her, or his warning is meaningless if he warns her about secluding herself with one who is, quote, not a man. Okay. So before we get into this, I just want to make this following qualifier. In English, the translation doesn't work well because I keep on translating as someone who's not a man. And when you say not a man in English, it almost sounds like the person's not human. And it's not fair or correct way of thinking about it. The term here, ish, in Hebrew, has a legal designation. It doesn't just mean a human. It is a legal designation, right? In fact, we have a number of different terms to describe a human. Ish, Adam, Enosh, Gever. And each of these names and titles imply something else. And they imply something else depending on how you're reading it. So, for example, if you're reading the verse, not in terms of Jewish law, but you're reading it as philosophical, psychological, then ish, edom, enosh, gever, all these different names for a human describe different character of being a human. Ish, for example, refers to emotions, adam, intelligence, and so on. So likewise, when you're reading it from a halachic perspective, whenever these terms are used, you have to ask yourself, what is the halachic term here? And that's when we translate into English, it doesn't work well because we're going to be talking about people who are certainly humans, but they don't necessarily qualify as the legal term of what an ish is. And that becomes the question. So we describe people as not a man. It does not mean they're not human. And it doesn't mean they're not male. It just means they don't qualify as ish. Example, exhibit A, a minor. A minor is a human, a beautiful human, that doesn't qualify legally as an ish. Because an ish is only an adult male, but not because the child lacks humanity, God forbid. So let's just keep that in mind as we go forward. So the Gemara asks, Lamute mai, who is being excluded here? Who is this person that we're saying is not an ish? And therefore, if the husband warned her about this person, the warning is meaningless because he is not an ish. And the verse says that the person about which he is being suspected is an ish. So option A is as follows. Ilema, you might suggest, lemute, what's being excluded here, or this person who doesn't qualify as an ish, is a shachuf. Shachuf is a person who's some sort of sickness, some sort of illness. And Rashi describes it as like a dried out flesh, something of that nature. And the person therefore lacks energy. And therefore the person, the technical motions of intimacy might be possible, and therefore there's a suspicion of infidelity, but he certainly could not finish intimacy, if you will, not being too graphic. Right? So he can be with her, but he doesn't have that capacity to fully engage sexually in its entirety as a young, healthy male would be able to. So perhaps he's the person that doesn't qualify as an ish. And therefore, if a person warns his wife about secluding herself with such a person, the warning is meaningless. This is the Gemara's first suggestion. The Gemara rejects this because Shmuel stated, Shachov, this person who has this illness, anyway, what I told you is a combination of what Rashi said and what Rabbi Hananel says in Tosfos. There's different ways of understanding it, but we're going to keep it simple. This person who's some sort of sickness does not allow him to complete the full sexual activity, even though he could do some to some degree. Okay, so Shmuel says, a shachov, this shachov, mekan al yadai, he could be warned about, or one could warn about him. So Shmuel is obviously of the opinion that a shachov does qualify as an ish. And therefore, if a husband warned his wife about secluding herself with a shachov, that warning would be valuable because Shmuel is of the view that he qualifies as an ish. He can be warned about. And likewise, paisel betruma, he invalidates a woman from eating truma. What this means is as follows. A daughter of a kohen, a kohenet, can eat while she's living in her father's house. She can eat truma, certain gifts that her father gets as being a kohen. She's allowed to eat that because she's part of his household. But the verse tells us that once she has a relationship with certain people that she should not have a relationship with, a non-Jew, a slave, someone who's a mamzer, someone born of an illegitimate relationship, as soon as she engages in such intimacy, the verse says, she becomes what's called a chalal. She becomes void of her kohanic status, and she can no longer eat truma. So Shmuel says, consistently, that this shachov, this person who suffers from this illness, qualifies as an ish. And if he qualifies as an ish, there are two consequences. Number one, a husband can warn his wife about secluding herself with this shachaf because he qualifies as an ish. And number two, if this shachaf engaged intimately with the daughter of a kohen, she'd become invalid from eating truma because she was with a ish. If this ish happened to be someone that would render her invalid from kuna, he was non-Jew, let's say, or he was a slave, or something of that nature. Is that clear? Yeah. Okay. So now the Gemara goes through within Shmuel these two details. How does Shmuel know that this shachaf qualifies as an ish for these two laws? What's Shmuel's reasoning to say that a shachaf qualifies as an ish, and therefore a husband can warn his wife about secluding herself with him? And likewise, that he's an ish to the point that if he was a non-Jew, if he was a slave or something like that, and then he had an intimacy with the daughter of a kohen, he would render her incapable of eating truma. Where does he derive that from? So says the Gemara. The fact that Shmuel says he qualifies as an ish, so that a husband can warn his wife about her. This actually, the Gemara says, Pshita, this is self-understood. Why is it self-understood? Because why not? Why isn't he an ish? Why isn't he an ish? Why shouldn't he be an ish? Just because he suffers from some illness, therefore doesn't qualify as an ish? So the Gemara says, well, maybe Ma'al Yotema might have thought, the verse says, ish oisa shichva zera. When the verse describes the ish that this woman is being suspected with, the verse describes him as he lay with her the laying of seed, meaning he engaged with her intimately. Amar Achmana, this is how the Torah describes this ish, as someone who was suspected or turns out he was intimate with her. And the Torah describes literally, he lay with her the laying of seed, meaning that he's capable of doing that. And this shachaf is incapable of that kind of seeding. So therefore, we need Shmuel to tell us, notwithstanding the fact that in this context, the verse describes an ish as someone who's capable of lying and producing seed, laying with a woman and producing seed. And therefore you might say the shachaf doesn't qualify, and therefore a warning to her about secluding herself with him would be rendered invalid. Therefore, Kamash Malon, Shmuel comes and tells us no. Notwithstanding the fact that the word ish here comes in context of sexual activity, nonetheless, he still qualifies as an ish. And the word ish should be like freestanding. It's true, the primary concern here is a sexual activity. But nonetheless, because he qualifies as an ish, even if he cannot consummate that sort of activity, nonetheless, he qualifies as an ish. But now at least we see why Shmuel had to tell us the statement and make us remember it. Because if not for Shmuel, I may have mistakenly concluded that an ish must be capable of full sexual activity. Because the verse puts the word ish here in the context of laying with her, with the laying of seed, if we can translate it literally.
He has a partial ability?
That's what it seems like from it's not 100% clear, but from
he has to have some ability. Is that the
yeah, he has some sort of ability.
Unlike a minor who really doesn't have it.
Well, actually, a minor doesn't have an ability. But by Torah concern, by Torah law, after 9 years old, a male is capable of sexual activity. But nonetheless, he still doesn't qualify as an ish, because an ish has to be an adult. That's clear. But the question is, a person who is a full male adult, but some issue that doesn't allow him to perform full sexual activity.
At least not the literal translation.
At least not the literal translation of the verse of providing seed. That's right. So Shmuel comes and says, that's correct. That's right. So Shmuel comes and says, even though you might have mistakenly thought that an ish doesn't qualify because he's not capable of that kind of activity, nonetheless, he's still an ish. And therefore, a husband could warn his wife about secluding herself with such a person. Likewise, Shmuel said that if this shachuf, this person who suffers from this illness of some sort, if he is one of these people, he's a non-Jew, he's a slave or something like that, and then he lays with a daughter of a kohen, he then makes her invalid from eating the truma. The Gemara says pshita, obviously. Well, why not? If he's an ish and he lay with a woman who is a kohen, daughter of a kohen, then why wouldn't he render her incapable of eating truma? Why not? So says the Gemara, a very similar thing to what it said before. Wow, the time I might have thought the verse which teaches us that a kohen, a daughter of a kohen, who is intimate with these forbidden relations, the verse that teaches us that this would render her void of her kohanic privileges, the verse reads, Lo yechalol zarai. The verse comes in a kind of warning, which is like this. Do not lay with these people so that you do not vacate your seed from the kohanic privileges. That's how the verse reads it. It's like a warning. Don't have this kind of intimacy, because if you do, it's going to invalidate, don't have such kind of intimacy, and in this way, you will not invalidate your children. That's the verse. Now Rashi tells us that the Gemara elsewhere points out that the verse where it says vacate, meaning vacate your children of their kohanic privilege, the word there is yachalel. And the verse could have says yachel with one lamed. The two lameds makes it plural to teach us that the vacancy, meaning or the stripping of the kohanic privileges that happens as a result of this intimacy is for two people. Number one, her offspring, and number two, for her herself. So what do we have here? When the verse tells us that intimacy with someone she shouldn't be intimate renders her vacant of her kohanic privileges, that is derived from the same exact word that tells us that the offspring they would have would be vacant of their kohanic privileges. And therefore, I might have concluded that the two are linked. Only someone who is capable in this sexual activity of producing children, that is when we apply this double verse. The child loses the kohanic privilege, and the mother loses the kohanic privilege, because the two are. You following?
Yeah.
When we say that the woman loses her kohanic privileges, it comes in the very same words that describes that the children lose their kohanic privileges.
You need the precursor of having children.
Exactly. At least the capacity of having. That's right. At least the capacity to have children. At least the kind of intimacy that's capable of producing children. That's right. So
you would have thought that this man can have children, therefore she doesn't.
That's right.
And therefore this is not one of the relationships.
That's right. That's right. So let's see the Gemara. I might have thought the verse reads, Lo yechalol zarai. Don't have such intimacy so that you prevent your seed from being stripped of the kohanic privilege. And this word stripped of the kohanic privilege has a plural, the two lameds, yechalel, and therefore it means she too loses her kohanic privileges. Amar Achmana, this is what the Torah says. The islay zera, and therefore someone who is capable of seed, of offspring, lichalel, that's the one who will cause through his intimacy to strip her and the offspring of their kohanic privileges, and therefore the less zera, and therefore this person who is incapable of seeding, shall not vacate her, shall not strip her of her kohanic rights, because the stripping of the kohanic rights comes along with the production of seed. That's how the Torah describes it. And therefore, Kamash Malan comes Shmuel and says, no. He's still considered an ish. He still qualifies as a full adult male, halachically speaking. And therefore, even though his intimacy can't produce children, and maybe his intimacy is incomplete, and so on and so forth, as described in the various commentaries describing who exactly this shachav is and what's the degree of his sickness. But either way, he constitutes as an ish. And therefore, if he was intimate with this woman, and he happened to be a non-Jew or something, he was one of these people that would render her incapable or render her stripped of her kohanic privilege, his intimacy would do that, even though he's a shachov. And likewise, a husband who warns his wife against secluding himself with a shachov, that warning counts. And if she secluded herself, she'd become a bona fide Sotah. Time for a few more lines?
Sure.
Okay. So a similar exercise, because we're back to square one. When the Mishnah told us that when he issues a warning against secluding herself with someone who is, quote, not a man, we're trying to figure out who is this non-ish. We haven't come up, back to square one. Who is the non-ish? Our first option was that the non-ish is this shachov, this person who has some sort of sickness or illness. We rejected that because he does qualify as an ish. So who's the next one? Says the Gemara. The next suggestion is ve'ela, rather lemute, when we say he cannot warn her against secluding herself with, or when we say that a warning issued that she shall not seclude herself with someone who is not an ish, and then that warning is meaningless if he warns her against secluding herself with a non-ish. Who is this non-ish? Says the Gemara, perhaps it is oived kechavim, a non-Jew. Maybe when the Torah describes the word ish, the halachic definition of ish is someone who is a Jewish male. We do have that sometimes. For example, Adam. The word Adam we know elsewhere. Atem kroyim Adam. When the Torah uses the term Adam, it refers to a Jewish male. So perhaps the same thing is true of ish. When the verse says ish, it means a Jewish male. This is why I gave the introduction earlier. Because if I just said a non-Jew is not a man, this would like raise the bells and whistles, and rightfully. Right? That's why I gave that qualifier to explain that it doesn't mean the translation in English doesn't work. It's not a man. This is a human. This is a man. Of course, it's a man. The question is, does this person qualify as the definition of, quote, ish? We know that it doesn't qualify as Adam, but maybe ish also means a Jewish male. And then when we talk about non-Jews, we have to use another word term, maybe enish, maybe gever. Right? You have to understand what's the legal definition here. What's the halachic definition of these words? So perhaps then the word ish means a Jewish male, and therefore a warning that he tells her, do not seclude yourself with this non-Jew, would be a non-valid warning. Okay. So it says the Gemara rejects that. Because if Ramnuna said, a non-Jew, a husband can warn his wife about her, warn his wife about him. So Ramnuna clearly is of the opinion that a non-Jew does fall under the legal rubric of ish. And therefore, a husband can warn his wife not to seclude herself with this non-Jew, and that would be a bona fide warning. And if she were to go ahead and seclude herself with this guy, she'd become a bona fide Sotah, even though the person about which we are suspecting is non-Jewish. And likewise, if this non-Jew had an intimate relationship with the daughter of a Kohen, because he is an ish, this would render her void of her Kohanic privileges. Now the Gemara is going to do the same exercise it did before.
To use that as the litmus test for analyzing this.
The two laws.
Because of this, if she loses her fund,
that's right.
It seems to be the litmus test.
Yeah.
This person can be right.
Because that's right, because the verse uses the word ish there too. It says kikach ish zar. He takes a foreign ish. So the same term is used here, ish and ish. So we have to see what the law would then be the same in both, right? Okay, so now the Gemara is going to do the same exercise as it did before. Rav Hamnuna told us that the non-Jew qualifies as an ish, and therefore a husband can warn his wife about her, and intimacy with him would render the daughter of a Kohen stripped of her Kohanic privileges. The Gemara is going to do the same exercise. Well, why would I think otherwise? Right?
Yeah.
Why would I think otherwise? Pshita, exactly. That's the question we've been asked before. The Gemara asks, Rav Hamnuna just told us that a husband can warn his wife about intimacy with, or about secluding herself with a non-Jew. Pshita, this is obvious. Why shouldn't he be able to? He's an ish. Yeah. Says the Gemara. No. Mao de Tema, I might have thought, and this is a similar argument we made earlier.
Well, yeah, just to interrupt. Sorry.
Yeah.
He's saying, yeah, because he's an ish, but that's circular reasoning, right? We're trying to define who is ish.
Right. So
you can't just say, oh, he qualifies because he's ish, but we're trying to.
Right. Well,
no, I'm just.
Yeah, that is a good point, but that is a good point. Let's come at this way, right? Let's do the generations and we'll understand a little bit better. So let's say there's the Mishnah, right? And the Mishnah said, well, there's the verse. The verse said ish. The Mishnah says ish means anyone who's not an ish doesn't count. Who's not an ish doesn't count. Right? Now we are down here and we're trying to figure out who is a non-ish.
Right.
So unfortunately, we don't have any texts up here that tell us who's not an ish.
Right.
But we do have some texts in between. And that's Rav Hamnuna and who was before Shmuel. Right. So once we establish from them that these persons are ish, right, then we have to ask ourselves, well, they know that they're ish. So what were they thinking that you might have thought otherwise?
Yeah.
Following?
The Mishnah takes for granted we know what an ish is.
Exactly. The Mishnah takes for granted we know what an ish is, but we happen to not know. So we look at other generations where they did know and then say, okay, they knew that these were ish. Well, what would have been the other way of thinking? Right?
Yeah.
Because we accept that what they say ish is what they meant by ish.
Yeah.
In other words, right? Because we, the analyzers here, don't have any agenda or don't have any opinion about what ish is. So if Shmuel comes along and says a shachov counts as an ish, we say, okay, well, why not? And then we have the other way argument. So like Rav Hamnuna, and Rav Hamnuna says a non-Jew counts as an ish. Okay, well, why would you think otherwise? Because we accept it just as because we have no opinion on the matter. We're trying to figure out what the opinions are, right? Okay.
Okay, good.
So let's see. So why would you think a non-Jew doesn't qualify as an ish in regard to warning his wife about her? So says the Gemara. Or let us say this way. Rav Hamnuna or Shmuel, instead of saying you can warn your wife about secluding herself with a shachov, and a shachov who lays with a daughter of a kohen makes her impure, he could have just said a shachov is an ish. Why do you not say it that way? Because even if you think she's an ish, the verses about these laws might have told you to seclude herself because the verse describes it as sexual activity, and this person is not capable of sexual activity. Right, which means the premise is that he's an ish, but he has to tell us that this ish even works in these two laws. Well, why not?
You would have thought otherwise.
Exactly. So you are going to believe that a non-Jew is an ish. Good, but you didn't just say that. You said that I can warn my wife about a non-Jew, or a non-Jew can render a daughter of a kohen invalid. Well, if he's an ish, why would I think otherwise? Following?
Yeah.
So let's see then. I would have
You
thought.
can't just rely on the conclusions. You have to know from where it was derived.
That's precisely.
The analysis.
That's right. Precisely. What's the background of that conclusion that makes us think a certain way?
Otherwise, people coming later on will apply it falsely.
That's right. Precisely. So the Gemara now makes a similar argument to what it did a couple of days ago, which is the verse says in relation to the law of the Sotah, nitma'a nitma, and we learn later in the Gemara, shtei pamim, the reason why the Torah says twice, nitma, she is impure, is to teach us, echad labal, the echad laboil. We had this before, that the one of the consequences of the Sotah law is that she can no longer be intimate with her husband, and she cannot marry the guy about which she was suspected, right? Mm-hmm. So we might have mistakenly concluded, heicha dekami mitzasra bahaznus. Who are the kinds of people that can count as a Sotah? Are the kinds of people who, prior to the Sotah proceeding, would have been permitted to her, and as a result of the Sotah proceeding, are not permitted to her. Because one of the consequences of the Sotah law is that she can no longer be married to this guy about she was suspected. So I might have thought that that's a qualifier. We had this earlier, that's right. That if, that's exactly, only someone who with the act of Sotah proceeding becomes forbidden to that woman, she qualifies as a Sotah. But over here, this non-Jewish person, the prohibition for him to be with her already exists. So you would have thought that therefore doesn't count as a Sotah. A Malay perhaps therefore doesn't count as a Sotah because only someone who all the consequences of the Sotah apply to, only that's the kind of person who can qualify as a Sotah. And one of the consequences of Sotah is that he cannot marry this woman. Now, in a case of a non-Jewish guy, this consequence doesn't apply because he anyways can't marry her. So Kamash Malon, therefore, Rav Hamnuna comes and says, no, even though the consequence doesn't apply, the law still apply, and he can warn her about secluding herself with this non-Jew. Similarly, and we'll conclude with this, Rav Hamnuna said, that if a non-Jew was intimate with a daughter of a Kohen, this intimacy strips her of her Kohanic privileges. So again, Pshita is obvious. If he's an Ish, why shouldn't it work? He's an Ish. So why shouldn't he strip her of her Kohanic privileges? Says the Gemara, I might have thought like this. The verse says, here's the verse which says Ish. Ubas Kohen, and the daughter of a Kohen, Tisiya le'ish zar, when she will be with a foreign Ish, foreign man. Now, this word shall be is tihiyah. There's different ways of describing a person having an intimate relationship with another person. It could say kisizana, if she were to behave frivolously with this guy, or she whored herself out of this guy. Different ways to say it. Kisiya means, and she was with him. Usually that's described as an exclusive marital relation. That's what the word sihiya, he shall be with her, or she shall be with him. Usually doesn't this describe an act of intimacy, but an exclusive marital relation. That's what we describe, for example, describe marriage is she becomes with him, tihiya, she's now his. So the term used to describe the forbidden intimacy is sihiya, almost like a marriage. And therefore, says the Gemara, Amar Achman, this is how the Torah describes their intimacy, as tihiya, as them being together, not just intimate together physically, but tiya, namely the bar havaya, only someone who, well, they aren't married. It was just it was only an act of intimacy. But maybe this is a qualifier. What's the kind of person who would render this kohen, this daughter of a kohen, stripped of her kohanic privileges? Is the kind of person who she could marry. That if they married, the marriage would be legitimate. For example, if a woman, like we learned this before, that there are certain marriages that the Torah says you shouldn't do, but if you do them, they're real marriages. How would you know? You'd have to divorce. If a guy gives his sister a ring and goes to the whole marriage proceeding, they don't need a divorce to separate because the marriage never happened, even though they went through all the motions. Likewise, but on the other hand, it's a void marriage. On the other hand, if a kohen marries someone who's not supposed to, even though he shouldn't have done it, if they got married, they would need a divorce to separate because the marriage was actually happened. So maybe then, this is the kind of person that would render her stripped of her kohanic privilege, the kind of guy to whom she could marry, even if she's not supposed to. And that's why the Torah uses the term kisiya, when he will be with her, to say that the kind of person she has to be with in order for her to lose her kohanic privileges is the kind of guy that she could be married to. And the la baravoya, someone who's incapable of making a marriage, loy, he does not qualify as someone who would render her stripped of her kohanic privilege, which is a non-Jew. A person who gets married to a non-Jew does not need a get, does not need a halachic divorce to separate, because the marriage never happened. And therefore, perhaps I would mistakenly conclude that because he's incapable of marriage, she's incapable of marrying this non-Jew, therefore intimacy with him does not render her stripped of her kohanic privileges, because she can't marry him. And the Torah describes the intimacy as being with someone kisiya, he is with her. And the Torah describes intimacy as being with someone who is she's capable of marrying, and she's incapable of marrying a non-Jew. So Kamash Malan, therefore, Rabbi says, no, he's an ish, and therefore his intimacy, the puzzle, this intimacy indeed invalidates her as a kohen, or strips her of her kohanic privileges, because he's an ish, even though they're not capable of marrying each other. Okay, I'm going to stop over here.
Back to square one.
So we're not almost done, because the Gemara is now tomorrow we'll look at the Gemara, which tells us how it is that we know, indeed, why is it, how do we know
That she loses her kohanic privileges?
That she loses kohanic privileges? Because, meaning, how do we know that a person,
He's an ish.
no, we know he's an ish, but the question is, how do we know, well, maybe indeed, only someone who is capable of marrying her is the kind of person who can strip her of her kohanic privileges. Maybe indeed.
Well, they're saying no. You're saying that's the Shita, right?
That's the opinion of Rabbi Nun to say no, but the Gemara is going to give us a backing from Rabbi Yochanan and a derivation from the verse to back up this opinion. That we're going to do tomorrow, and then we're going to get back to square one. Who is this non-ish that he's
Oh,
warning her
we're
about.
still gonna argue this, Gentile,
We're not going to argue it, but we're going to substantiate it, backing it up from the verses.
that he's an ish,
No,
that he's not an ish?
that he is an ish, but that even though he cannot marry her, he still renders her invalid for priesthood, even though he can't marry her. This very notion that Rav Nuna just said,
Which is an ish.
which is an ish, yeah. Okay, a wonderful day, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. God bless you. All the very best. All the best, Yeshua. Take care. Thanks.
Have a good day.
Have a great day, Judge. Thank you.
Thank you.